Easy now, keep it coming down. Watch the gap on bay 4. Steady. Set it. We are good to go.
In November 1942, at the Kaiser shipyard in Richmond, California, the workers built a ship in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. From the moment the first keel plate was laid to the moment the completed vessel was handed over to the War Shipping Administration, less than 5 days had passed. The ship was named the Robert E. Peary, after the Arctic explorer. It was a Liberty ship, a cargo vessel of standardized design, 441 feet long, displacing 14,000 tons when loaded, capable of carrying 10,000 tons of war supplies across any ocean in the world. It was not the most sophisticated ship ever built. It was not the fastest or the most beautiful or the most technically impressive. But in November of 1942, with the Battle of the Atlantic consuming Allied shipping at rates that were threatening to strangle the entire Allied war effort, the Robert E. Peary represented something that mattered more than sophistication or speed or beauty. It represented the answer to a question that the German submarine fleet was asking every night in the North Atlantic. Can the Allies replace ships faster than we can sink them? The answer, it turned out, was yes, but only barely for a time. And understanding why, understanding how close the question came to being answered differently, and what it took to make the answer come out right, is one of the most important stories of the Second World War. Because the Battle of the Atlantic was not won at sea, though the sailors who fought it deserved every credit for what they did. It was won in the shipyards. It was won by the application of industrial logic to a problem that the established shipbuilding industry had insisted could not be solved that way. It was won by Henry Kaiser and his construction crews and the hundreds of thousands of workers who had never built a ship in their lives before 1942 and who, by 1943, were launching one every day. The strategic situation in the Atlantic in 1942 was the closest the Allied cause came to genuine catastrophe. Not on any particular battlefield, not at any single moment of decision, but in the slow arithmetic of merchant ship losses against merchant ship production that, if it had continued to resolve in Germany's favor, would have cut the supply lines and held the entire Allied war effort together. Britain was an island. It required imported food to feed its population, imported raw materials to supply its factories, and imported oil to power its aircraft and ships and vehicles. The United States was building up its forces for the offensives that would eventually defeat Germany, but those forces needed to be supplied across the Atlantic. The Soviet Union, fighting the largest land war in history on the Eastern Front, was receiving Lend-Lease material through the Arctic convoys that sailed from Iceland to Murmansk and Archangel. All of these supply lines ran through the Atlantic. All of them were under attack by the German submarine fleet. The German U-boat campaign of 1942, the period that German submariners called the Second Happy Time, achieved losses of Allied and neutral shipping that were, in their aggregate, catastrophic. In the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank more than 3 million tons of Allied shipping. The losses were concentrated along the American East Coast, where the Navy's initial failure to implement convoy procedures left individual merchant ships sailing alone in waters that German submarines had moved into following the American entry into the war. Tankers and cargo ships were sunk within sight of the lights of Miami and Cape Hatteras and the Virginia Capes, their burning hulks visible from shore, their oil slicking the beaches. The scale of the disaster was kept from the American public to the extent possible, but the people who were tracking the numbers understood that the Allied merchant fleet was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. The problem was not simply the sinkings. The problem was the ratio, the relationship between sinkings and new construction. If the Allies could build ships faster than they were being sunk, the Atlantic lifeline would hold. If they could not, the supply lines would thin and eventually fail, and the consequences for the Allied war effort would be severe. In 1942, the ratio was moving in Germany's favor. The question was whether American shipbuilding could be mobilized quickly enough and at sufficient scale to reverse it before the damage became irreversible. This is the moment I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. The Battle of the Atlantic is one of the longest and least told campaigns of the Second World War, fought in the dark in the cold, over thousands of miles of open ocean by men whose names most people have never heard. If these stories matter to you, subscribe now and make sure you don't miss what comes next in this series. And now back to the shipyards, back to 1941, and the man who was going to change everything about how ships were built, the specific geography of the Battle of the Atlantic, the vast area of open ocean over which it was fought, the specific locations where the tactical balance shifted, is worth examining in some detail because the geography shaped the campaign in ways that are not always visible in the submarine narrative. The North Atlantic convoy routes ran roughly from Halifax in New York, in the west of Liverpool and Bristol, and the Clyde in the east, a distance of roughly 3,000 miles. The convoys sailed in roughly rectangular formations, with the merchant ships in columns and the escort vessels on the flanks and ahead and astern. The purpose of the formation was to concentrate the ships so that a limited number of escort vessels could protect a large number of merchantmen. A convoy of 60 ships in a compact formation required fewer escorts than 60 ships sailing independently, because the escort vessels could be positioned to cover the whole group rather than each individual ship. The convoys were effective against submarines operating on the surface in daylight, which was the dominant form of submarine attack in the early years of the war. A U-boat on the surface could be spotted by lookouts or aircraft and forced to dive, where its speed was limited and its endurance was short. But the Germans adapted. They developed the wolf pack tactic, coordinated attacks by multiple submarines, typically at night, from multiple directions simultaneously, that was specifically designed to overwhelm the defense of a convoy by attacking from more directions than the escorts could cover at once. The wolf packs operated under central direction from the German naval headquarters, with Admiral Donat's staff coordinating the positioning of individual submarines in the path of oncoming convoys, using intelligence about convoy routing. This intelligence came primarily from two sources: German air reconnaissance over the eastern Atlantic, which could locate convoys departing from British ports, and signals intelligence, the decryption of Allied convoy routing messages. The Germans had broken the British naval cipher number 3, which was used for communications between the Admiralty and convoy escorts, and were reading it with a regularity that allowed them to route submarines into the path of specific convoys. The Allies were simultaneously trying to decrypt German naval communications, the Enigma traffic, and succeeded intermittently, with a degree of penetration varying as the Germans changed their procedures and the Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park worked to re-establish access. The intelligence war within the Battle of the Atlantic was, at times, a direct confrontation between the two code-breaking establishments, each trying to read the other's communications while protecting its own. The periods when Allied code-breaking was effective, when convoys could be routed around known submarine concentrations, resulted in dramatically lower losses. The periods when German code-breaking was effective, or when Allied penetration was interrupted by German cipher changes, resulted in dramatic increases in convoy casualties. The correlation between the intelligence situation and the casualty rate is visible in the monthly loss statistics in a way that demonstrates, as clearly as any historical evidence can demonstrate anything, that the code-breaking contributed significantly to the outcome of the battle. The mid-ocean gap, the area of the North Atlantic beyond the range of land-based aircraft from either side, was a killing ground of the Battle of the Atlantic for most of 1942 and into 1943. Convoy escorts could be protected by aircraft from Iceland or from Newfoundland or from Britain for portions of crossing, but in the middle of the ocean, hundreds of miles from any air base, the convoys were on their own. A U-boat in the mid-ocean gap could operate on the surface at night, find a convoy, conduct its attacks, and submerge before any aircraft could reach the scene. The solution to the mid-ocean gap problem was the development of very long-range aircraft, specifically the Consolidated B, 24 Liberator bomber modified for maritime patrol, which had the range to cover the gap from both sides, and the introduction of escort carriers, small carriers built on merchant ship hulls that could accompany convoys and provide air cover in areas beyond shore-based aircraft range. The escort carrier program was itself a production achievement. 45 escort carriers were built in American shipyards and transferred to the Royal Navy under Lend-Lease during the war, in addition to the carriers built for American use. They were not elegant warships, but they were present in the mid-ocean gap, and their aircraft found and sank submarines that would otherwise have operated freely. The anti-submarine weapons available to Allied escorts improved dramatically during the battle. The early escorts relied primarily on depth charges. Canisters of explosives set to detonate at specific depths dropped from the stern or rolled off the sides of escort vessels over the location where a submarine was believed to be. The depth charge was effective against submarines directly below the attacking vessel, but it required the escort to pass over the submarine's position, during which the ship's own propeller noise interfered with the sonar that was tracking the submarine. By the time the depth charges detonated, the submarine had moved, and the pattern of explosions often missed. The introduction of the Hedgehog, a forward-firing weapon that projected a pattern of contact fuse bombs ahead of the escort ship, allowing the sonar contact to be maintained throughout the attack, significantly improved attack accuracy. The Squid, introduced later in the war, was an even more effective forward-firing weapon that used depth-fused charges in a pattern calculated from the sonar contact. The Lee Light, a powerful searchlight carried by maritime patrol aircraft, designed to illuminate surface submarines that were detected by radar but invisible in the dark, contributed to making night surface operations increasingly dangerous for U-boats. A submarine caught on the surface at night by an aircraft carrying a Lee Light had little time to die before the aircraft was overhead. The combination of radar detection and searchlight illumination turned the Atlantic night from a U-boat haven into a hunting ground for Allied aircraft. The escort vessel program that provided the surface forces to protect the convoys was its self-production story parallel to the Liberty ship story. The destroyer escort, a smaller, less expensive, and faster-to-build alternative to the destroyer that could be produced in large numbers, was a primary American contribution to the convoy escort force. More than 400 destroyer escorts were built in American shipyards during the war, in addition to the convoy escorts built for the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy. The combined Allied escort force that protected the convoys by 1943 and 1944 was large enough and equipped with good enough weapons and sensors that a U-boat operating a convoy route was more likely to be sunk than sink a merchant ship, a reversal of the odds that had prevailed in 1942. The specific mathematics of the Liberty ship production achievement deserve a closer examination than they usually receive, because the numbers are so extraordinary that they can become abstract, a statistic rather than reality. Consider what it actually meant to launch 2,710 ships in roughly 4 years of wartime production. 4 years is approximately 1,460 days. 2,710 ships in 1,460 days is roughly 1.86 ships per day across the entire American shipbuilding program, significantly more than 1 ship per day, every day, for 4 years. To put this in context, the entire United States Merchant Marine in 1939 consisted of roughly 1,340 ocean-going ships. The wartime production program therefore more than doubled the existing fleet in 4 years, while simultaneously replacing the vessels that were lost to enemy action, accidents, and wear. The net result was a merchant fleet at the end of the war that was larger than any merchant fleet in history, larger than the pre-war American fleet by an enormous margin, and large enough to serve not just the American war effort, but the British and Soviet and other Allied requirements under Lend-Lease as well. The prefabrication technique that made this production rate possible is worth describing in more detail, because the engineering logic behind it was not obvious, and its successful implementation required solving problems that the established industry had considered unsolvable. A Liberty ship hull consists of a series of structural sections, bow, stern, and multiple midship sections, plus the superstructure and the machinery spaces. In traditional shipbuilding, all of these would be built in place on the slipway, with each component fitted to the adjacent components as construction progressed. The fitting process required skilled workers and significant time, because the dimensions of early components affected the dimensions of everything that followed. Kaiser's approach was to fabricate the sections in separate facilities away from the slipway, to predetermine dimensions that were specified tightly enough that sections from different fabrication facilities would fit together correctly when assembled. The sections were large. A midship section might weigh several hundred tons, and moving them to the slipway and positioning them for assembly required heavy cranes and careful planning. But the assembly at the slipway was much faster than traditional construction, because the components were already complete and needed only to be joined rather than built. The welding that joined the sections was the critical quality control point. It had to be done correctly, with proper heat input and proper technique, or the structural continuity of the hull would be compromised. The cracking problems that plagued some early Liberty ships were partly a consequence of welding quality issues that were identified and corrected as the production system matured. The steel that went into the Liberty ships was itself a significant production challenge. Each ship required approximately 3,000 tons of steel plate and structural steel, produced to specific metallurgical specifications, and rolled to specific dimensions. Across the full production run of 2,710 ships, this represents more than 8 million tons of steel. Steel that had to be smelted, processed, and delivered to the shipyards on a schedule that kept the production lines running. The steel mills of Pennsylvania and the Midwest were operating at their maximum capacity throughout the war, and the coordination between the steel production schedule and the shipyard production schedule was one of the central logistical challenges of the entire shipbuilding program. The engines that powered the Liberty ships were triple expansion steam, reciprocating engines, a technology that was already mature and well understood in 1942, chosen specifically because it could be produced in large quantities by a range of manufacturers using existing tooling. More sophisticated engine types would have been faster or more fuel efficient, but they would have required specialized manufacturing capability that was not available in the quantities needed. The practical choice of proven technology over optimal technology was a consistent pattern in the Liberty ship program. Every design decision was made with production feasibility as the primary criterion, and the result was a ship that was not the best possible ship, but was the best ship that could be built in the numbers and on the timeline the war required. The boilers that generated the steam for the engines were manufactured at several facilities across the country, including Combustion Engineering Works and the Babcock and Wilcox plants, which had decades of experience producing industrial boilers and could adapt their production to the Liberty ship specification with relatively modest retooling. The electrical systems were manufactured by General Electric and Westinghouse and several smaller companies, again using existing manufacturing capacity, redirected to the war requirement. The deck machinery, the winches and windlasses and capstans that a cargo ship needs to work its cargo and handle its anchors, came from a range of marine equipment manufacturers. The entire supply chain for the Liberty ship was a wartime improvisation built on existing industrial capacity, coordinated by the Maritime Commission and the War Production Board to produce output at rates that the individual suppliers had never previously approached. The role of the Maritime Commission in coordinating this production effort deserves more credit than it typically receives. The Commission, established in 1936 to revitalize the American merchant marine, had been working on a problem of rapid emergency shipbuilding before the war began. Its chairman, Emory Land, and its administrator, Howard Vickery, had developed the plans and the contacts and the relationships with the shipbuilding industry that allowed the wartime program to begin immediately when the emergency arrived. Vickery, in particular, was the driving force behind the production targets that the yards were expected to meet, targets that were initially dismissed by the industry as impossibly optimistic and that were eventually exceeded. He understood the production logic of the Kaiser approach, and he supported it against the resistance of the established industry. And his support was essential to the program's success. The rivalry between Kaiser and the established shipbuilding industry is part of the story that gets overlooked in the celebration of production achievement. The men who ran the traditional yards, the Bath Iron Works in Maine, the Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, the Federal Shipbuilding in New Jersey, had decades of expertise and genuine pride in their craft. They watched Kaiser's newcomer yards win contracts and government support with a mixture of professional skepticism and competitive resentment. They pointed to the quality problems in the Kaiser ships. They questioned the safety of vessels built by untrained workers using unproven methods. They were not entirely wrong to raise these questions. The cracking problems were real, and the quality control issues in the early production were genuine, but they were arguing, in effect, for a slower and more careful approach at a moment when slower and more careful was not an option the war allowed. Kaiser won the argument, in the sense that the production results he achieved were the results the war required. But the traditional yards also contributed significantly to the wartime program. They built the Liberty ships and Victory ships and naval vessels that the war required, within their own traditions and at their own pace, which was faster than anything they had previously attempted. The total American shipbuilding achievement was a product of both the new yards and the old, of Kaiser's industrial innovation and the traditional craft of the established builders, combined in a production program that dwarfed anything the industry had previously attempted. The human experience of the Battle of the Atlantic, on the merchant ships and on the escort vessels and in the submarines, was shaped by the specific character of the North Atlantic environment. The Atlantic in winter is among the most hostile environments on Earth for human beings at sea. The waves are large, 50 feet and more in severe storms. The water is cold enough to kill an unprotected person in minutes. The visibility is limited by spray and fog in the short winter days, and the ship motion in heavy weather is violent enough to prevent normal sleep and make simple tasks like eating and moving about the ship physically demanding. The men who fought the Battle of the Atlantic fought it in this environment for months at a time, under the additional stress of knowing that attack could come at any moment with little warning. A merchant sailor torpedoed in the North Atlantic in winter had at most a few minutes before hypothermia began to incapacitate him, assuming he survived the initial explosion and flooding and reached the water. Lifeboats offer protection from the water but limited protection from the cold, and rescue was not always quick. A convoy under attack could not stop, could not slow down, could not illuminate itself to look for survivors, because stopping or slowing was a death sentence for the entire convoy. The ships that were not hit had to keep moving, and the men in the water had to wait. Some were rescued hours later. Some were never found. The escort sailors who hunted submarines lived under a different but comparably intense stress. An escort vessel at sea in the North Atlantic is small relative to the waves, uncomfortable, and continuously in motion. The watchkeeping routine, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, around the clock, for weeks at a time, produced a permanent background of fatigue. The knowledge that a submarine could be anywhere in the convoy's vicinity, that the sonar contact could materialize without warning, that the attack when it came would be sudden, and that the response had to be immediate and correct. This knowledge was present throughout every watch, every hour, every crossing. The submarine sailors on the German side lived with the knowledge that their boats had become increasingly dangerous places as the battle turned against them. The early U-boats that operated in the second happy time in 1942 had high survival rates. Their crews returned from patrols to a welcome in German ports and the confidence of men who were winning their campaign. By 1943 and 1944, the survival statistics had reversed. A German submariner who went to sea in the Battle of the Atlantic in the last 2 years of the war was statistically unlikely to return. The German submarine service lost roughly 75% of its personnel during the war, the highest loss rate of any military service in any combatant nation. The men who continued to go to sea as the odds mounted against them were not lacking in courage. They were fighting in a campaign that technology, production, and intelligence had turned decisively against them. The final accounting of the Battle of the Atlantic is worth stating clearly. The Allied merchant fleet lost approximately 3,500 ships, totaling more than 14 million gross tons during the war. Roughly 72,200 Allied merchant sailors were killed. The Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, and United States Navy lost hundreds of escort vessels and thousands of naval personnel. The German submarine fleet lost 783 U-boats and approximately 30,000 men, roughly three-quarters of everyone who served in it. Against these losses, the Allies built more than 5,000 merchant ships during the war, enough to more than replace the losses and support the Allied war effort on a scale that the pre-war merchant fleet could not have sustained. The Liberty ships alone, 2,710 of them, represented a production achievement that changed the mathematics of the battle at the moment when the mathematics most needed changing. That is what Henry Kaiser built in his Richmond yard, not just ships, the margin of survival for an entire alliance, delivered one launch at a time, in the face of a threat that was trying to sink them faster than they could be built. The ships won, the alliance survived, the supply lines held, and the war that was fought across those supply lines ended the way it ended, in the defeat of Germany and Japan, and the survival of the world that the Allies were fighting to protect. Henry Kaiser was 59 years old when he received his first shipbuilding contract in 1940. He had spent his career as a construction contractor, a builder of dams and highways and bridges, a man who understood large-scale engineering projects and the management of large workforces and the organization of complex supply chains. He had never built a ship. He knew nothing specific about naval architecture or marine engineering, or the traditions of the shipbuilding industry. What he knew was how to build things fast, how to organize men and materials for maximum output, and how to apply the logic of industrial production to problems that experts had decided required artisanal craftsmanship. The shipbuilding industry that Kaiser was entering had been doing things the same way for generations. Ships were built in place, assembled on a slipway from the keel up, with each component fitted and adjusted to the ones around it in a process that required skilled tradesmen working for months or years to complete a single vessel. The work was not interchangeable. Each ship was, in a meaningful sense, a custom product, shaped by the specific materials available and the specific judgment of the workers building it. The idea of applying assembly line logic to this process, of prefabricating standardized sections in factories, and then assembling them at the slipway, reducing the total construction time from months to weeks, struck most of the established industry as at best impractical and at worst dangerous. Ships that were built that way wouldn't hold together. The experts said the welds would fail, the hulls would crack, the sea would find the weaknesses that speed and mass production inevitably introduced. Kaiser built them anyway. He started with 4 yards, at Richmond and Oakland in California, at Portland and Vancouver in Oregon and Washington. He built the yards themselves in parallel with learning how to build ships, constructing the facilities and training the workforce simultaneously, because there was no time for the sequential approach. The Liberty ship design that the Maritime Commission had developed was ideal for his purposes, a deliberately simplified vessel based on a British tramp steamer design that had been deliberately stripped of any feature that wasn't strictly necessary. The hull form was a simple shape that could be produced in standardized sections. The machinery was straightforward and reliable. The design had been chosen specifically because it could be built by workers without prior shipbuilding experience, in facilities without the specialized equipment of established shipyards. The workforce Kaiser recruited was overwhelmingly made up of people who had never built anything remotely like a ship. They came from farms and small towns and cities across America, drawn by the wages and by the patriotic urgency of wartime work. Women were recruited in large numbers for welding, for the fitting and assembly work, for the administrative and logistical functions that kept the yards operating. African-American workers came from the South, following the jobs, entering an industry that had been almost entirely closed to them before the war. The training programs that Kaiser developed could bring a new worker to basic competence in the specific task they would be performing in a matter of weeks. The specialization that assembly line production required meant that each worker needed to know how to do their specific job very well, rather than needing the broad skill set that traditional shipbuilding had required. The learning curve was steep but short. The prefabrication approach that made the Kaiser yards so productive required solving a logistics problem of considerable complexity. The hull sections that would be assembled at the slipway were fabricated at separate facilities and then transported to the yard. The sections had to be produced at tolerances tight enough that they would fit together correctly when assembled, which required a level of precision in fabrication that was difficult to achieve at the scale and pace the yards were operating. The quality control problems in the early months of production were real. Not just the cracking problems that the established industry had predicted, though those occurred and required engineering solutions, but the full range of problems that any new production system encounters when it is ramped up faster than its processes have been fully developed. The cracking problem was serious enough to require systematic investigation. Liberty ships in service were experiencing fractures in their hulls, some of them catastrophic. Ships breaking in two in cold water, the steel failing in ways that the original design had not anticipated. The investigation that followed identified the root cause as a combination of factors. The welded construction method introduced stress concentrations at certain joints that riveted construction would not have created. The steel specification used for the ships had properties that made it more susceptible to brittle fracture in cold water than the designers had known. And certain details of the hull form created stress concentrations that the loading conditions of service exposed. The solutions, changes to the steel specification, modifications to critical joints, the addition of crack arrest straps at vulnerable locations, were identified and implemented, and the Liberty ship cracking problem was brought under control, though it was never completely eliminated. The quality issues were real and they were addressed, but they did not stop the production. The yards kept building. The workers kept coming. The ships kept launching, and as the production system matured and the workforce gained experience and the quality control processes improved, the pace of production accelerated rather than slowed. The record set by the WWII period in November 1942, 4 days, 15 hours, 26 minutes, was a demonstration rather than a typical production time. Normal production times were longer, but the trajectory of improvement was consistently downward. From months to weeks, from weeks toward days, from days toward the point where the limiting factor was no longer labor or materials or process, but simply the physics of the work itself. The women who worked in the Kaiser yards contributed to this trajectory in ways that the official history of the time did not always adequately acknowledge. The welding work that was central to the Liberty ship construction method was performed to a significant extent by women. Women who had been told, by the culture they grew up in, that this kind of work was not for them, and who discovered that it was not only for them, but that they were good at it. The specific skills required for welding, the steady hand, the control movement, the ability to maintain consistent arc length and travel speed over long periods, were not skills that men possessed and women lacked. They were learned skills, and women learned them as effectively as men, in some cases more so. The community that grew up around the Richmond shipyards during the war years was one of the most dramatic examples of wartime demographic transformation in America. Richmond's population grew from roughly 23,000 in 1940 to over 100,000 by 1943, an increase of more than 400% in 3 years, driven almost entirely by the influx of shipyard workers. The city's infrastructure, its housing, its schools, its hospitals, its water and sewage systems, was overwhelmed by this growth. The federal government and the city authorities improvised frantically to keep pace, building housing projects, expanding schools, establishing health clinics, constructing the basic services that a suddenly much larger city required. The improvisation was imperfect. Many workers lived in conditions that were crowded and uncomfortable, but the yards kept running, and the workers kept coming, and the ships kept launching. The individual workers who built the Liberty ships left behind a record of the wartime production effort that is, in its own way, as compelling as the battle records of the sailors who sailed the ships. The Kaiser yards at their peak employed more than 90,000 workers across the 4 West Coast facilities, men and women from every part of America and from a range of backgrounds that the peacetime shipbuilding industry would never have assembled. The training programs that Kaiser developed for his workforce were among the most effective large-scale vocational training efforts in American history. A new worker arriving at the Richmond Yard in 1942 would be assigned to a training program specific to their job function: welding, fitting, burning, rigging, electrical work, and within a few weeks would be performing that function in production. The training was deliberately narrow and deliberately practical. You learned to do the specific thing production system required you to do, and you learned to do it well. The breadth of knowledge that a traditional shipbuilder's apprenticeship developed over years was replaced by the depth of a specific skill developed over weeks. The assembly line logic that made this possible also made it limiting. A worker who knew how to weld a specific type of joint in a hull section knew a great deal about that joint and relatively little about anything else. But in a production system designed to produce thousands of identical ships as fast as possible, that was exactly the knowledge that was needed. The women who worked in the Kaiser yards did so in the face of institutional resistance that had to be overcome before the manpower, or woman power, emergency of wartime production forced the issue. The shipbuilding industry had been even more thoroughly male than the automobile industry before the war. The physical demands of the work, the welding, the fitting, the work in confined spaces and a height on scaffolding, were cited as reasons why women were unsuited for it. These reasons turned out to be largely wrong. The physical demands of specific shipyard jobs varied enormously, and many of the jobs that women were assigned to in the Kaiser yards were no more demanding than work that women had done in other industries for decades. The welding work in particular, which required skill and precision more than brute strength, was performed by women at quality levels that met and in some cases exceeded the standards set by male welders. The African-American workers who came to Richmond from the South encountered a mixture of opportunity and discrimination that was characteristic of the wartime experience in the industrial North. The wages were better than anything available in the South. The jobs were real jobs, with union wages and overtime pay and the prospect of advancement based on work performance rather than race. The housing available to black workers was often inferior to what white workers could access. The federal housing projects were frequently segregated in practice, even when they were not required to be by law. And the private rental market was subject to the same discriminatory practices that existed in the private housing market everywhere in America. But the economic opportunity was real, and the workers who came to Richmond in pursuit of it stayed, many of them, after the war ended, establishing the community that exists there today. The specific ships that the Kaiser Yards produced had individual histories that are worth tracing, because the Liberty ship was not just a production statistic. It was a vessel that carried specific cargo on specific voyages, crewed by specific people, lost in specific ways when it was lost. The SS John W. Brown, launched at the Bethlehem Fairfield Yard in Baltimore in 1942, survived the war and is today one of 2 Liberty ships still in operating condition, maintained as a museum ship in Baltimore, where it offers periodic cruises as a living demonstration of what these vessels were. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, launched at the New England Shipbuilding Corporation Yard in South Portland, Maine in 1943, is the other, maintained in San Francisco and remarkably still seaworthy, having made a voyage to Normandy in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. The Arctic Convoy Route, the supply line from Iceland and Britain to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel, represents one of the most demanding and least celebrated supply operations of the war. The convoys sailed through waters with a combination of German air attacks from Norway-based aircraft, German surface warships operating from Norwegian fjords, and German submarines made the route dangerous in ways that the North Atlantic was not. The weather in the Barents Sea and the approaches to the Kola Inlet made the North Atlantic look mild. In winter, temperatures were so low that spray froze on the superstructure and had to be continuously chipped away to prevent the ship from becoming top-heavy. In summer, the continuous daylight eliminated the cover darkness that convoys elsewhere could rely on. The most catastrophic episode of the Arctic Convoy Campaign was the destruction of Convoy PQ-17 in July 1942. The convoy, 35 merchant ships and their escorts, was ordered to scatter by the British Admiralty when intelligence suggested that the German battleship Tirpitz was at sea and posed a threat to the convoy. The decision was catastrophic. Without the protection of the escorts, the individual merchant ships were hunted down by German aircraft and submarines over following days. 24 of the 35 ships were lost. The 153 surviving merchant seamen who were rescued reported conditions that were, by any measure, among the worst experienced by any Allied personnel in any theater of the war. The Murmansk Run, as it was known to the sailors who served on it, required a particular kind of courage, the courage of men who had been told what they were sailing into and who went anyway because the cargo mattered. The tanks and aircraft and food and raw materials that the Arctic convoys delivered to the Soviet Union contributed to the Soviet capacity to fight on the Eastern Front, which was the largest and most costly theater of the Second World War. The arithmetic of what the Soviet Union required to sustain its war effort and what the convoys delivered is difficult to quantify in terms of specific battles won or lost. But the Soviet commanders who received the Lend-Lease material understood its value, even when Soviet propaganda obscured the acknowledgement of American and British contributions. The contribution to the convoys to the Allied war effort was recognized, eventually and incompletely, in the post-war period. The merchant mariners who served on the Atlantic and Arctic runs received recognition of their wartime service through the Merchant Marine Act of 1988, which granted them veteran status, and through the subsequent availability of veterans' benefits. This recognition came 43 years after the war ended, long after many of the men who had served had died, and well after the practical value of benefits programs was limited for those who survived. The Kaiser shipyards themselves did not survive much beyond the war. The production infrastructure that had been built at such speed and at such scale was not suited to peacetime commercial shipbuilding, which required different capabilities and operated on a different economics. The yards were sold or scrapped or converted to other uses in the years after 1945. The workforce dispersed. Some went back to where they had come from. Many stayed in the Bay Area or the Pacific Northwest, as Richmond and Portland became their home in ways they had not anticipated when they arrived to build ships for the duration. The production records of the Kaiser yards were archived and studied by the post-war maritime industry and by the production engineers and management theorists who were trying to understand what had been accomplished and what lessons it offered for a peacetime industrial organization. The conclusions were mixed. The prefabrication and assembly techniques that Kaiser had developed were applicable to peacetime commercial shipbuilding and were eventually adopted widely. The specific management approaches that had produced the wartime results were harder to replicate in a peacetime context where the urgency was absent and the economic pressures were different. The Liberty ship production miracle was, in important ways, a product of its specific moment. The combination of wartime urgency, unlimited government funding, a compliant and motivated workforce, and a specific design optimized for fast production that could not be exactly reproduced under different conditions. Henry Kaiser himself went on to other ventures after the war. The Kaiser Permanente healthcare organization, which he had developed during the war to provide health care for his shipyard workers, became one of the most significant innovations in American healthcare delivery of the 20th century, a lasting legacy of the wartime production program. The ships themselves were his most visible contribution to the war effort, but the healthcare organization that he built alongside them to keep his workforce healthy and productive outlasted the ships by decades and serves millions of people today. The story of the Liberty ships is, at its core, a story about what is possible when a society decides that something must be done and commits to doing it at whatever scale is required. The shipbuilding industry had decided, based on decades' experience, that ships could not be built the way Kaiser built them, could not be built that fast by workers without prior experience, using prefabrication techniques developed for construction rather than naval architecture. The industry was wrong, not because the challenges it identified were not real. They were real, and the cracking problems and the quality issues that the early ships experienced were genuine, but because the determination to solve those challenges and keep producing was stronger than the challenges themselves. That determination was the product of specific human beings making specific decisions. Kaiser and his managers, the workers who came to Richmond and learned to weld and fit and burn, the Maritime Commission officials who kept the contracts coming and the money flowing, the naval architects who redesigned the problematic details of the hull and the joints. And behind all of them, the sailors who needed the ships to keep coming because the alternative was defeat. The ships kept coming. The sailors kept sailing. The cargo kept arriving. The war was won. The German submarine campaign against Allied shipping did not simply continue unchanged as American production increased. The Battle of the Atlantic was a technological and tactical competition that evolved continuously on both sides. The Germans improved their submarines, their communications, and their tactics. The Allies improved their convoy procedures, their escort tactics, their anti-submarine weapons, and their intelligence about submarine movements. The role of signals intelligence in the Battle of the Atlantic parallels the role of JN-25 breaking in the Pacific. The Allied ability to decrypt German naval communications, including the messages that coordinated the movements of U-boat wolf packs, contributed significantly to the eventual Allied advantage in the battle. The turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic came in May 1943. In that month, the German submarine fleet lost 41 U-boats, roughly a third of its operational strength, to Allied anti-submarine forces. The losses were the product of multiple converging factors: improved Allied convoy procedures, the deployment of long-range aircraft that could cover the mid-ocean gap that had previously been beyond air cover, better weapons and sensors on escort vessels, and intelligence advantage that Allied code-breaking provided. Grand Admiral Dönitz, commanding the German submarine fleet, withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes in May 1943. He described it as a tactical withdrawal that would be reversed when the technical situation improved. It was not reversed. The Battle of the Atlantic had been won. By the time Dönitz withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic in May 1943, American shipyards had launched enough Liberty ships to reverse the ratio of sinkings to new construction that had looked so threatening in 1942. Allied shipping losses continued through the rest of the war. Submarines and mines and aircraft continued to take a toll on merchant vessels, but the margin production over loss had become comfortable enough that it was no longer the existential threat it had been. The Atlantic lifeline was secure. The supply of food and fuel and weapons and vehicles and troops to Britain and to the growing Allied forces in the Mediterranean and eventually in France, could continue at the pace that the strategic plan required. The Liberty ships themselves were, by any objective measure, not elegant vessels. Their crews complained about their motion in heavy seas. The blunt bow and full hull form that made them easy to build made them uncomfortable to sail in the North Atlantic swell. Their speed was slow, 11 knots at best, which meant a convoy could make the Atlantic crossing in roughly 2 weeks under favorable conditions. Their accommodations were Spartan. Their machinery was reliable but uninspiring. The men who sailed them knew they were sailing in vessels built to be expendable, built to deliver their cargo and, if lost, to be replaced by another vessel identical to them that had come off the same production line a week later. The sailors who crewed the Liberty ships, the merchant mariners who did not receive the same military recognition as the Navy men who escorted the convoys but who faced the same dangers and absorbed comparable losses, performed their essential function under conditions of sustained stress that are difficult to convey to people who have not been at sea in a war zone. A merchant mariner sailing a slow cargo ship in a North Atlantic convoy in the winter of 1942 understood that a U-boat could be anywhere, that the standard warning time between the first indication of attack and the moment of impact was measured in seconds, and that a torpedo hit on a ship carrying aviation gasoline or ammunition could produce an outcome that left no time for a lifeboat. They sailed anyway. They made the crossings, convoy after convoy, because the war required it, and because they understood what the cargo meant to the people waiting for on the other side. The statistics of merchant mariner casualties in the Second World War are not as well known as the military casualty figures, but they deserve to be. The United States Merchant Marines suffered a casualty rate during the war that exceeded that of any American military service. Roughly 1 in 26 merchant mariners who served was killed, a proportion higher than the Army's overall rate and comparable to Marine Corps. They were not in uniform, at least not in a recognized military uniform. They did not receive veterans' benefits after the war, not for decades. Their contribution was essential, and their sacrifice was real, and their recognition was delayed by the same institutional factors that delayed recognition for so many of the people whose contributions to the war were invisible to the public narrative. The Liberty ships that they sailed and that the Kaiser yards built were eventually supplemented and partially replaced by a more capable vessel, the Victory ship, a slightly larger and faster design that was produced in the final years of the war. The Victory ships were better vessels in almost every respect, but the Liberty ships were there first, in the quantities that the crisis demanded, and the crisis was what they were built for. More than 2,700 of them were built between 1941 and 1945. Several hundred were lost to enemy action and to accidents and to the stresses of hard service. The rest delivered their cargo, voyage after voyage, convoy after convoy, until the war was over. Some of them outlasted the war by decades. Liberty ships were sold into commercial service after the war, some of them sailing into the 1970s and beyond, their utilitarian hulls carrying commercial cargo in the same steady, unhurried way they had carried war supplies across the wartime Atlantic. A few were preserved as museum ships or training vessels. The Patrick Henry, the first Liberty ship launched, was eventually sunk as a target in weapons testing. The Robert E. Peary, the ship that set the construction record, was scrapped in 1963. The record she set, 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes from keel to completion, was never broken, which is appropriate, because it was never meant to be broken. It was meant to demonstrate what was possible when the urgency was great enough, and the will was strong enough, and the workers were good enough. The will was great enough. The workers were good enough. And the ships that they built, in the numbers that they built them, in the time that they built them, saved the Atlantic lifeline, and with the entire Allied war effort in Europe. That is what the Liberty ships were. That is what the men and women who built them accomplished. An answer to a question that the war was asking every night in the North Atlantic. And the answer was yes. Yes, we can build them faster than you can sink them. Yes, the lifeline will hold. Yes, the cargo will get through. It did. The war was won. And the ships that carried it were built in a yard in Richmond, California, one every few days, by people who had never built a ship before and who turned out, when the moment required it, to be exactly what was needed. The legacy of the Liberty Ship Program extends beyond the war in ways that are still visible in the American economy and in American life. The Kaiser Permanente Healthcare Organization, which Kaiser built to provide medical care for his shipyard workers and which became the model for prepaid group practice health care in the United States, now serves more than 12 million members and employs more than 300,000 people. It is a direct descendant of the wartime recognition that keeping a large workforce healthy was a production requirement as much as a humanitarian one, and that the traditional fee-for-service medical model was inadequate for that purpose. The technique of prefabricated construction that Kaiser pioneered for the Liberty ships was adapted and applied in the post-war construction industry, in the building of houses and commercial buildings and infrastructure projects that use prefabricated components to reduce construction time and cost. The management techniques that Kaiser developed for coordinating large, geographically dispersed production operations became case studies in business school programs. The organizational innovations of the wartime production program did not disappear when the war ended. They entered the permanent stock of knowledge about how large-scale production could be organized, and they shaped the American industrial economy of the post-war decades. The merchant mariners who crewed the Liberty ships received their veterans recognition late and incompletely. The men who survived, who came home from the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Arctic and the Mediterranean carrying the experience of wartime service at sea, returned to a civilian economy that valued their skills but did not provide the specific benefits that their military counterparts received. The GI Bill, which transformed the educational and economic prospects of millions of veterans, was not available to merchant mariners until 1988, when the Merchant Marine Act finally granted them veteran status. By then, the men who had sailed the Liberty ships in their 20s were in their 70s and 80s, and the benefits that might have shaped their post-war lives had become largely symbolic. The ships themselves are mostly gone. Of the 2,710 Liberty ships built, a handful survive as museum vessels or in continued commercial service in remote parts of the world. The great majority were scrapped in the decades after the war, their steel recycled into the post-war economy. The Richmond yards, where so many of them were built, are now an environmental cleanup site, the industrial infrastructure of the wartime production having been removed and the contamination left behind being addressed decades later at considerable public expense. The specific place where the Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes is now part of Shoreline Park, the urgent production of 1942 replaced by the quieter uses of peacetime. The record stands. 4 days, 15 hours, 26 minutes. One ship, built by workers who had never built a ship before, in a yard that had not existed 2 years earlier, using methods that the established industry had said were impossible. The answer to the question the Germans were asking every night in the North Atlantic. Yes, we can build them faster than you can sink them. Yes, the lifeline will hold. It did. Consider, finally, the sheer human arithmetic of what the Liberty Ship Program accomplished. Each ship required, at the Kaiser Yard's average production time, the coordinated labor of tens of thousands of workers over several weeks. Multiplied across 2,710 ships, the aggregate labor represented by the Liberty Ship Program is staggering. Hundreds of millions of hours of human effort, performed by workers from every corner of America, organized into a production system of unprecedented scale and efficiency. Each hour of that labor was a specific person at a specific workstation, doing a specific thing that contributed to the specific ship that was being built at that moment on that slipway. Each ship was the aggregate of all those hours, and each convoy crossing was the aggregate of all those ships, and each ton of cargo delivered was the aggregate of all those crossings. The food that reached Britain, the tanks that reached the Soviet Union, the ammunition that reached the Allied armies in North Africa and Italy and France, all of it traces back, at some level of the supply chain, to a worker in Richmond or Portland or Baltimore or South Portland who showed up for a shift and did their job. The war that was fought with that supply chain was won. The world that emerged from that victory is the world we live in. The connection is direct, and it runs to the hulls of 2,710 ships that were built in American yards by people who understood what they were building them for.